Well, in 1998, after meeting Constable Pete Cornick, who has family in Grand Bank and was stationed there, and another Constable, Len Brayon, who was stationed in Grand Bank, and who I was acquainted with and knew me. My wife and son and I went to the Irving station in Donovan's for a Sunday lunch because the night before I had explained to them that after all these years I felt I had to go back to the authorities again and try and get justice. But I had to speak to them before I did that and said to my wife, Audrey, if you want to leave, I'll understand. And I said to my son, I'm sorry for having to do this, but I had to do it for your sake and mine so we can both have a life of our own. And he said, that's okay, Dad. So the next day we go to Donovan's Irving to have lunch, and I ran into these two RCMP officers, and Len Brayon came and talked with me and said, Byron, you don't look like you're doing very well. And I said, no, sir, things aren't so good. And he said, you know, what's going on again? And I told him, and he said, yeah, I understand. And him and Pete Cornick were there, and he said, Pete, why don't you get him to come into the office and report this again? I said, Byron, you should report it again. And I said, yes, sir, I'm going to. And he said, well, Pete, you sit through it with him and help him through every way you can.
So when was the first? You reported it way back in the '60s as well, right? That was
This
the
was
first time.
98, was the final time. But in 1960, I reported to a Sergeant Sturge. I was sitting on the wharf on a Sunday morning, and I was alone, sitting on the edge of the stage there, Studley stage, and Sergeant Sturge was dressed in his hat and red uniform with his breeks and big eye boots on. And he said, what are you crying about? So I had explained to him what was happening at home and what my mother was doing with me and playing with my privates. And he said, you come with me. So he took me by the hand and we went back to our house, and he lectured my mother and told her, he said, if you ever put another hand on him again, I'll see that you're put in jail yourself. And she was real mad and changed colors. Anyway, he said to me, he said, now you come with me and we'll walk back up. He said, I got a new police car. I remember the car was waiting to have Mr. Patton. Lou Patton would get the cop cars ready for him with the lights and the doors and signs and things. And it was a 1961, a new car, a Dodge Dart. And he said, we can look at the car and she'll cool off while we're gone. So I said, okay, sir. So I went back with him, but when I went back home, she hadn't cooled off. I got a good shit knocking as it was. But that was 1960. And then in 1965, there was a policeman at home that his name was Gilbert White. Gilbert was we had a police boat in Grand Bank that patrolled the coast because of the St. Pierre Islands, the French islands. Gilbert was an RCMP officer there who was also a very good friend of my Aunt Jessie Snook Grandy now. And they just walked together with their friends, and Gilbert spent time with them. So in Grand Bank, there's one bridge in the town over the river. I was headed from my house to my grandmother's house because my mother was after abusing me, and I was crying going across the bridge. And Constable White and my Aunt Jess and two of her friends were walking across the bridge. And he said to me, he said, Byron, what's wrong? And I said, I'm going to Gran's house. That was my grandmother's. And he said, there's something wrong. And I said, yes, sir. My mom has been picking at me again, and she's beating on me and my sisters. And he said, you come with me, Byron. We're going to stop this. So we went back to the RCMP office in Grand Bank, and he wrote everything up. And the person was on call at that time. He talked with him, and he said, okay, I'll go talk with her. So I went and walked with Mr. White, and my aunt and her friends for a while, and as far as I knew, the other constable went to speak with our mother. Nothing changed. Everything stayed the same. Nothing was done.
This was 64 or something?
That was 64, 65. In 1966 and 67, there was Corporal Sparks was in Grand Bank in charge. And after 1966, when Hickman did this to my sister, I had some real hard times. In 66, right after that, I took a whole mess of my mother's pills. She always had a purse full of pills. Anyway, they took me to the hospital in 66 and pumped my stomach out. I was 13. So I got through that, but in 67, I was pretty tired of seeing my sister get so large that I hardly knew her anymore from being pregnant. So I went to Corporal Sparks, who was stationed in charge in Grand Bank, and I spent all morning filling out a formal report, telling him what had happened, how I'd followed my mother and my sister to Hickman's campaign party, and what had happened, and who actually was the father of my little sister's baby. He said he'd take care of things and made all the notes for 4 or 5 hours during the morning. All the talk with Corporal Sparks got me was a visit from my uncle, who took me out in his boat and threatened to drown me. That was the only results I got from that report. After that, there was a Corporal Eaton came to Grand Bank. He was a friend to everyone. Actually, him and his 65 Mustang, black one, the first one ever in our town. So all the young fellas, I was into cars. I liked cars, so I talked to him a lot. Anyone who talked with me could understand there were things wrong. So he asked me, and I told him. And he said, yeah, Barn, there's got to be something done about it. So I said, okay, sir. So he said, I'll see what I can do, and we'll talk about it later. Anyway, every time later when I'd go to the police office, that he'd be busy, and they'd tell me, why don't you come back Sunday when not so much is happening? So Sunday after Sunday, I stood on the step with no one there. Nothing happened. And then later in, I guess, 68, 69, maybe 70, Len Brayon came to Grand Bank. Another fellow that knew everyone in town, and one of the guys that I'd met at the Irving with Pete Cornick. And the same thing, and it was 1970, I was sitting on the wharf in my old car. I had an old 64 Pontiac that I bought for $75 out of a scrap heap, and I repaired it to use and put it in my mother's name for insurance. So she kicked me out, and I went to sleep at the head of the wharf in my car, and Len Brayon and Richard Foote, the municipal cop, came on the wharf and saw me there and got me out of my sleeping bag and said, look, Byron, if you don't take the car back home, we got to arrest you because your mother has reported you for stealing the car. And I said, fellas, this is my car. It's just in her name. And you know what I got to go back to at that house if I go back, what she's going to do to me. And Constable Len Brayon looked at me, an RCMP officer, and said, I know that, Byron, but there's nothing I can do about that. You got to take the car home or I'm going to arrest you. So I said, I got to go and be abused or else you're going to abuse me and arrest me. And he said, I'm sorry, that's the way it is.